Evening. This is Minister Foster coming to you again from the Pillar of Grace Church, Houston, and we're continuing with our 40 Days of Purpose by Rick Warren. We've been going over this for the last few weeks, and again, we start with a new week and a new day, and this just happens to be our last week of the 40 Days of Purpose. And so we've enjoyed our time, and we've enjoyed uh, digging into these different days of purpose and finding out exactly what our purpose is and what God is intending for us to do with our lives. And so again, we're moving on to another day of purpose. This is indeed day 35. So that means we have 5 days left. So let's go ahead and let's take care of these 5 days with purpose. Let's come to an understanding of what we have learned and how much we have grown over the past month or so. And let's start to talk about the things that we see within ourselves that we didn't see a day ago, that we didn't see a few weeks ago, that we didn't see a month ago, but we see them now because we have started to live a life of purpose. We started to live according to our purpose. And so for day 35, what we'll be talking about today is God's power in your weakness. God's power in your weakness. And that may sound a little bit contradictory to you, trying to find the weakness, trying to find the power from your weakness, but that is exactly what we intend to do today, is to find God's power that lives within your weakness. And the Bible tells us that for though he was crucified through weakness, yet he lived there by the power of God. For we also are weak in him, but we shall live with him by the power of God toward you, which is 2 Corinthians 13:4. And so it's saying essentially that Jesus was crucified. He was crucified, and at the moment of his crucifixion, that was in his weakest state. That was in his weakest mental state. That was in his weakest bodily state. He was physically torn down. He was physically ripped apart. He was in a weakened state, but yet by the power of God and his resurrection, that weakness became the ultimate power. And the same thing applies to us as individuals and as a family of believers in Christ, is that we are in a weak state throughout the course of any given day. But in that weakness, God will also find a way to turn that weakness into power for us for the benefit of his kingdom. So everyone has a weakness. Everybody, me, you, anybody who's listening, anybody who's not listening, everybody on this planet has a weakness. In fact, you have a bundle of flaws that may be imperfections, physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. You may also have uncontrollable circumstances that weaken you, such as financial or relationship limitations. The more important issue is, what do you do with these weaknesses and limitations? Usually, we deny our weaknesses. We try to downplay our weaknesses because we always want to bring what we do well or what we're good at to the forefront of our minds. Because, of course, if we do good at something or we enjoy doing something and we have a skill or a talent for it, then of course that's going to make us happy, because anytime you can do something and you excel at it, that will make you happy because you have a sense of pride and confidence in what you're doing. And we defend our weaknesses. We make excuses for our weaknesses. We try to hide our weaknesses from people. And oftentimes we resent our weaknesses. We feel like our weaknesses are what is holding us back in life. Those are the things that are making it difficult. Those are the things that are causing us struggle. Those are the things that are putting hurdles in front of us that we have to overcome, our weaknesses. So we don't embrace weaknesses at all. And a lot of parts of our society do not embrace weakness. They feel like weakness is something that is that needs to be removed or needs to be replaced or needs to be overcome with something greater. And so we look at weakness as a negative thing, when in reality it is not a negative thing, because God's going to use that weakness for something greater for us. And so when we are in our weakened state, that is when God is best able to use us. That's when he's able to get our attention, when we are in our weakened state. That's when he's able to, uh, you know, have us understand that at the end of the day, we can be as good as we want to be at a bunch of different things, but our weaknesses are still present. And because of those weaknesses, as good as we are at something, we still need God. When you try to hide your weaknesses, or when you try to deny your weaknesses, this prevents God from using them the way he desires. When we can admit our weakness, we allow ourselves to be used by God for a more glorious purpose. We allow him to use us for the purpose that he intended. We allow him to use us in the way that he would use us. We all have weaknesses, each and every one of us. They may be physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and that spiritual weakness is one that's very difficult for people to understand. They feel like they don't have any spiritual weaknesses, but absolutely you have a spiritual weakness. I do. The members of the church do. The pastor does. The first lady. Everybody has a spiritual weakness, and those are the things that God uses us for in our ministry to make us stronger individuals and make us stronger as a body. He uses the weaknesses that we have so we can draw nearer to him. And once we draw nearer to him, then we have the ability then to overcome some weaknesses and use those weaknesses as our strengths. You have to understand that you can't place the blame on other people for your weaknesses. You can't blame somebody else. The weakness that you have is all yours. The insecurity you have is all yours. The situations that you place yourself in due to your weaknesses and insecurities, it's all yours. But the good news is that God understands that, and he's already planned for a victory and a way for you to come out of that with a stronger attitude, because he's going to use that weakness for your benefit. So you can't blame other people. You can't place the blame on circumstances. You can't make excuses for your weaknesses or resent them. You just can't. You have to accept them. But God has a different perspective and an outlook on your weakness. God has a different perspective for your weakness. The scripture tells us that as the heavens are higher than the earth, and that being the case, the heavens being higher than the earth, there are God's ways that are higher than our ways, right? Because the heavens are higher than the earth, and God's ways are higher than our ways, and God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, which is Isaiah 55:9. He wants to use your weakness, right? He wants to use your weakness in such a way as it will be an example or a testimony for other people. So in other words, whatever you've been through in life, whatever thing has caused you some heartache, whatever thing has caused you some pain, whatever thing has caused you some strife, those are the things that God is going to use. Those weaknesses are what he's going to use for you to be a testimony to somebody else who may be going through right now what you have gone through before. The same way that we are healed because of Christ's wounds, because of Christ's stripes, we are healed. Somebody else can be healed by your stripes. Somebody else can be healed by your experiences. Somebody else can be healed by your testimony. And that is why we use those weak moments in our lives, and we don't hide them, but we bring them to the forefront and we speak on them, because you never know who is going through something that you have already gone through, and your story and your testimony may be a living witness to what they can eventually become if they allow that weakness to be used as a strength in the manner that God would have it be used. You are going to draw other people to God based on your weaknesses and allowing your weaknesses show. It's not just about your strengths, but it's about your weaknesses. So again, when you show your weaknesses and you allow your weaknesses to be out in the forefront for people to see you in a vulnerable state, then that lets them know that I'm not the only one who's not perfect. I'm not the only one who's gone through some things. I'm not the only one who's having difficulties with a particular part of my life. And so when I see somebody else who's not perfect and who's going through things like I went through, and they were able to come out on the other side like gold, then I believe too that I can do the same thing. So again, you're going to be a living testimony for somebody based on your own weaknesses and your own pains and your own sorrows and your own suffering. Somebody's going to be saved because of what you've already gone through. And the thing about it is, God has chosen things for you already. And the thing about what God is going to do, God is going to take those weak people and he's going to use them to show the strong people. He's going to take a certain person who has gone through something, who may be in a weakened state, and he's going to prove to the person who may think they're always strong that no, you're not. because I'm showing you an example of this human being, which you are as well. So if this person is going through something, you can stop lying to people and telling them that you're not going through something as well. We all are going through things, and God is going to show that, right? God has chosen the foolish things to confound the wise, and He has chosen the weak things to confound the mighty. It's as simple as that. He's going to choose those people who are in a weakened state to prove to the people who may feel like they are in a superior state that He is God. And regardless of what you think you may have done on your own, He is going to show you that He is God and He is the one that puts you where you are. And He's going to show you that by showing you how He moves within a person's life who may be in a weakened state. And He brings them out of that state for His glory, and so that He can show you that this is who I am. I am God, and where you are is where I have placed you. So again, God has chosen the foolish things to confound the wise, and He has chosen the weak things to confound the mighty. This shows us that our weaknesses aren't accidental, but they are intentional. Your deficiencies were given to you not to embarrass you, but to illustrate to you, right? Your deficiencies, again, were not given to you to embarrass you, but they were giving you so that way you can be an illustration for someone else, to show others that there is something for them too. Again, if I show my weakness, if I show myself in a weakened state, again, it's not for somebody to say, oh, look at Minister Foster. He's telling us his business, or he's putting himself out there, or he's showing, his weakness, or he's showing these are some things that bother him, or these are some things that upset him, or these are some things that I've gone through in my life that I may not necessarily want to share with people. But if I want to be a living testimony to somebody else, then I absolutely have to share. But again, God is not asking me to share these things so that I may be embarrassed, but He's asking me to show these things so that way I can be an illustration to somebody else about how they can go through what I've gone through and come out on the other side. Everything that you go through in terms of your weaknesses and in terms of your life experiences, they have a purpose. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about 40 days of purpose. And in that 40 days of purpose, it's going to be some times where you're going to have to reveal yourself to people in order for them to understand what you're doing, where you're coming from, and exactly what you're trying to accomplish in your purpose. You have to be transparent. You have to be visible. You have to share. You have to let people know these are the things that I've gone through, and you can make it through it too if you go through the same thing, as long as you have God on your side, right? Jesus even speaks on weakness, right? We talk about weakness, but Jesus spoke about weakness, and He spoke about weakness as a blessing, right? Matthew 5:3 says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He's telling you right there that if you are poor in spirit, that is equal to being weak or being in a weakened state. If you are in a poor spirit, then He's saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So He's already telling you that being in a weakened state is not a curse, but it is a blessing. And the Bible is filled with examples of how God uses imperfect people for His perfect plan. He uses imperfect people for a perfect plan. A weakness is something that is difficult to change, and what you consider a weakness is indeed a strength, excuse me, again, when it's used by God. You may be tempted to say, God could never use me. I'm not the type of person that God is going to use for anything. Even if I don't feel like I'm in a weakened state, I just don't feel like I'm the type of person that God is going to use. But here's the good news today. Here's the good news. God is not limited by your limitations. In other words, how you feel about yourself is not going to limit how God decides to use you. He can take anybody He wants to and use them for whatever purpose He wants to. And so our own limited thinking and our own limited way of self-evaluating ourselves is not going to limit how God uses us. He loves putting great power into ordinary containers, right? He loves doing things with ordinary containers. He took an ordinary container that was filled with ordinary water, and He blessed it, and it turned into extraordinary wine. So He can take a plain container and take whatever's inside of it and turn it into whatever He desires for it to be. So we already know that us being the container that he's using now, we're just like that container that held that water. He can take the water that's in us. He can take the water that some may seem as weak, and he can turn that weakness into extraordinary wine. He can turn us into something that everybody wants to be attached to. He can turn you into something that everybody wants to be around. He can turn you into somebody that everybody wants to listen to, because now he's using that vessel for his purpose and not the purpose that it was intended for. So we have to understand that the power comes from your limitations or weaknesses and how God uses it. That's where the power comes from. It comes from you having weaknesses and limitations, but those weaknesses and limitations have to be used by God, and that's where the power comes from. So the first thing you have to do in order to understand that weakness is you have to admit your weakness. You have to admit it. You have to own your imperfections. Stop pretending that you have it all together and be honest with and about yourself. You have to be honest with yourself, and you have to be honest about yourself. Peter and Paul both confessed their weaknesses, right? And then those two confessions are some of the most important parts that we talk about in the Bible. When Peter said, "Thou art Christ," because Jesus asked him, "Who do you say I am?" He said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Blessed, you know, you're the Son of the living God." So he confessed right then and there that he knew who Jesus was, which was the Son of the living God, right? And Jesus replied to him, "Blessed art thou, Simon, for flesh and blood hath not revealed this to you, but my Father which is in heaven. Thou art Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and hell shall not prevail against it," right? So at that moment, Peter recognized, he confessed that he knew who God was. And because he confessed he knew who God was, God immediately took him from being Simon to Peter and told him, "On this rock I will build my church." So that's the first part. Admitting your weakness and admitting that you know who God is in your life is the first key, because now God knows that you understand that you didn't get where you are because of yourself. You got there because of God. And because now you have that realization and that understanding, now he can use you. Now he can do what he wants to with you, because now you understand. It's not that hard. And Paul said, "We are also men of like passions." Basically, what he was telling the crowd who was in there about to worship false idols in the temple, and they ran in and tore their clothes off and basically interrupted the whole ceremony, was there telling them, "Look at us. We are just like you. We are men. Even though we may have walked with Jesus, we may have talked with Jesus, we may have seen Jesus perform miracles, we may have performed miracles ourselves through him. But at the end of the day, we are just like you. We are men." So that's the second confession. The first confession was, "I know who you are, God." And the second confession is, "I know who I am. I am simply a man. I'm simply a man." And so while Paul has made that confession, now God understands that Paul knows that he's just a man, and everything he does for God, everything he does through God, is only because of God. Everything else is because he's just a man. And so we have to get to that understanding, those two confessions. I know who God is, and I know that I'm just a man, or I know I'm just a woman. These two examples show that if you want God to use you, then you have to know who God is, and you have to know who you are. These two confessions allow God to build from your example and your testimony, and you become his rock. You see how that works? You become his rock. Before, Simon was a follower of Christ, but at the moment when he confessed that he knew who Christ actually was, at the moment that he confessed that he knew that Christ was the Son of God, at that moment Christ knew that he could use Simon as Peter, and Peter would be the rock on which he built his church. So when you do the same thing, God says, "Okay, now I can use you as my rock. Pastor J, I can use you as my rock now. Lady J, I can use you as my rock now." Whoever you are out there right now that's listening to this, God can use you as his rock the moment that you confess that you know who he is, and that you confess that you know who you are. From that point on, he can use you, right? And he can use you in spite of your weaknesses. The next thing you have to do is be content with your weakness. That's a hard one. You have to be content with your weakness. And I don't mean, oftentimes people, they hear this and they feel like it's a contradictory statement. In other words, I need to be happy, or I need to be content with being weak. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the reality is that being content with weakness isn't accepting weakness. It's understanding it and its purpose. So it's understanding that you may be weak in a certain area of your life, and you don't necessarily want to be weak in that area. But the second that you acknowledge that you are, you need to be content in the fact that your weaknesses and your shortcomings are going to be handled by God, and he's going to use it for a mighty purpose. So I'm content with the fact that I may be weak in a particular area, because I know that wherever I'm weak, eventually God is going to use it for his benefit through me. And so I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with being weak in the area, but I'm okay in how my weaknesses is going to be used. I'm okay in how my weakness is going to be turned around. I'm okay in how my weakness is going to help somebody else through my testimony. I'm okay in how my weakness is going to allow me to be a living testimony for others who may be weak in that same area as I am. So I'm content in that fact. And that's what you have to be. You're satisfied in God's plan, and you're satisfied in your role in God's plan. As I referenced earlier in the nugget that I'm doing today, as I referenced earlier, God has used people throughout history who were imperfect, but they were a part of a perfect plan, right? We know that God used Moses to bring his people out of Egypt, right? Moses was a murderer, right? He murdered an Egyptian and he fled. God used him. We know that Moses had a slow of speech. He stuttered. He had problems with getting his thoughts out. God still used him. Those were two weaknesses that did not stop God from using Moses for what he intended to use Moses for. And he was able to do it because, of course, he's God. As soon as Moses accepted the plan, then he was good to go. God could use him as the rock. We know that God used Gideon. Gideon had low self-esteem. He didn't feel like he could do anything. He didn't feel like he could accomplish anything. And he started out with 32,000 soldiers to fight the Midianites. And God reduced that 32,000 to 300. Not because he just wanted to show that he was all powerful, but he wanted Gideon and everybody else to realize that their salvation had come not from themselves, but it came from God. So he used a person who had low self-esteem. He used a person that was down on themselves. He used a person that didn't think they would accomplish anything. And he still used them for his benefit. We know that Abraham had fears. Abraham was tested with Isaac. We know Abraham had fears. He denied that the fact that his wife was his wife twice because he feared for his life. And out of that fear and out of that weakness, out of that insecurity, Abraham became the father of nations. God can use you regardless of where you come from. God can use you regardless of what your situation is. God can use you regardless of what your weakness is. He can use you, right? Peter was an impulsive, weak-willed person, right? Peter was a hard person to deal with, and he became the rock that the church was built on. David was an adulterer, and he became a man after God's own heart. Now, if David can become a man after God's own heart, then anybody can make it. Anybody can do what David did if David was able to come through. But David understood who God was, and David understood who he was. And so God was able to use David for that purpose. And we know that John was one of the sons of thunder, right? That's what Jesus called him and his brother. You were the sons of thunder. Why? Because they were ready to go to war and battle over Jesus. They were ready to fight people physically for Jesus. And that wasn't, of course, his way. And so he called them the sons of thunder because they were always ready to start something. They were always ready to get in the mix. They were always ready for a good fight. So he called them the sons of thunder. But even John, who was a son of thunder, became the apostle of love, right? So he took a person and completely flipped their whole mentality around simply because that's the way he intended to use them from the beginning. When he met those brothers, he knew how they were. He knew the type of brothers they were. He knew they were ready to fight and go to battle. But he also knew where they were going to end up. He knew that John was going to be that apostle of love, which is why he chose him. So he took somebody who was ready for war and made them a person of peace. God can do anything he needs to do as long as you're willing to let him use you for that purpose. You never know how God can use your weakness. You never know. Another thing you have to do is be able to honestly share your weakness. You have to be able to honestly share your weakness. Ministry begins with vulnerability. That's how ministry begins. It begins with vulnerability. The more you let down your guard, the more God will be able to use you in serving others. It's called being vulnerable. But vulnerability is risky. It's scary. To lower your defenses and open up your life to other people because people are so judgmental. They just are. When you reveal your fears, your frustrations, your failures, your feelings, people are judgmental. They don't think about what you're telling them. They're thinking about what you're telling them means to them. Not what it means to you, but what it means to them. So people become judgmental. So it's hard and people get fearful about sharing their weaknesses. But it's absolutely worth it. Why is it worth it? Because it is liberating to let people understand that I'm not perfect, but I'm working on me. I don't have it all together, but I'm not stopping. I'm not a perfect person, but I'm not quitting. And I'm using God, and God is using me to get me where he wants me to be. So even though I may show you these weaknesses, or even though I may talk about these weaknesses, or even though I may reveal some of my fears, or reveal some of my frustrations, or reveal some of my failures, or my feelings, and I take a chance at people judging me based on that, I'm willing to take that chance because at the end of the day, it's liberating. I'm free because I've shared. I'm free. Now you know where I'm coming from. And so there's no misunderstanding. There's no confusion. You know how I feel. You know what I've been through. You know where I'm trying to go. And so you should be able, if you are a Christian with me, you should be able to help me get to that place because if I succeed, then you succeed. And God gives us grace. He gives grace especially to the humble. And the more humility you have by being humble, the more grace you can receive. And that's why God wants your weaknesses and not your strength. People who always show strength and they don't show any, vulnerability, and they always feel like they got it together and nothing's wrong with their life and everything is great, they are not real. They are not real, nor are they approachable. They're not approachable people. Why? Because it's difficult to approach somebody who has an air about them like they're perfect. And it definitely don't make good leaders, right? People who won't share and people who refuse to admit that they have weaknesses are not good leaders. Your weakness makes you real. People see you and know that if God can use you, despite your weakness, then he can use them as well. And so our strengths that we have, or the strength that you try to portray to other people, even though we know that everybody has a weakness, but when you try to portray a continuous strength that is unbreakable, that creates competition. Strength creates competition. Weakness creates community. I'm going to say that again. Strength creates competition. Weakness creates a community. At some point, you have to decide if you want to impress people or if you want to influence people, right? It's two different things. You have to decide if you want to impress people or influence people because, again, strength creates competition. Weaknesses create community. When we can show our weaknesses together, then we have something to lean on amongst ourselves that binds us together. If we can all agree that we are weak in a particular area of our lives, that we're not perfect people, that we do make mistakes, that we do have weaknesses, and we can come together in that agreement, that's going to make us a much stronger community than it would if everybody was assuming or acting like that everybody else was perfect. Because we know that's not real. It is not real. It is not sustainable. You're going to get tired if you try to portray a perfect person, a perfect life, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You're going to wear yourself out, right? You're going to make yourself sick because everybody's not perfect. So it's not a sustainable thing in order for you to act like you're perfect every day of the week. You just can't do it, right? So again, you have to decide if you want to impress people or if you want to influence people, you can impress people from a distance, right? You can impress somebody from far away. Somebody can see you doing something from far away and they can be impressed. Somebody can hear you speaking from far away and they can be impressed. But if you want to influence somebody, you have to do it up close. Up close and personal is how you influence somebody, right? You influence somebody by the actions that you take, the words that you say in that particular person's presence, meaning you are one-on-one having a conversation, or you are one-on-one performing an action. You influence others by what you do up close. And the thing about being up close is the closer you get to something, the more flaws people can see in you, right? The further away you are, it's very hard to pick out individual flaws on somebody from a distance. But once you get close up on somebody, you can pick flaws left and right. And I'm not just speaking about physical flaws. I'm talking about flaws in every sense of the word: physical, emotional, spiritual, everything. The closer you get to somebody, the easier it is for them to pick out your flaws. And you have to understand that when people can see your flaws, especially if you're a leader, if people can see your flaws, that's better. It's better for a person to see your flaws as a leader than it is for them to look at you and feel like you are perfect. Why? People don't want perfection. They don't want perfection. They want credibility. And the way that you have credibility comes from you building up trust. And that trust comes with vulnerability. So credibility comes from vulnerability, meaning that if I'm a leader and I show that I'm not perfect, I can admit when I'm wrong. I can admit when I don't know everything. I can admit when there's a better way besides my way. When I show that weakness and that vulnerability to the people who follow me, then they understand that my credibility is going to be more than somebody who always assumes that they know everything, somebody who always assumes that their way is the best way, somebody who won't listen to suggestions, somebody who won't listen to another person's opinion. I'm not going to follow that person. Why? Because they have no vulnerability. And if they don't have any vulnerability, they have no credibility. And that's as simple as it gets. The last thing you have to do is recognize that there is glory in your weakness. There's glory in your weakness. You need to see yourself as a trophy of grace, right? You are God's trophy of grace, meaning that your weakness and your ability to let God use that weakness for his purposes is what's going to make you a trophy to God. It's what's going to make God put you out front. It's what's going to make God put you on a pedestal so he can show you off to other people, whether they be believers or non-believers. He's going to show you off as a trophy of grace because of his grace, you are able to take that weakness and turn it into a strength. Because of that grace, you are able to use that weakness for the benefit of somebody else through your testimony. You have to wear your weakness like a badge of honor. You have to wear it. You can't hide it. You can't conceal it. You can't deny it. You have to wear your weakness like a badge of honor. When Satan wants to point out your weakness, that's fine, because he will, and he'll use other people to point out your weakness. He'll use them in person. He'll use them on social media. Absolutely. He'll use people to point out your weaknesses. And when Satan does that, that's fine. You take that and you turn it around with praise for how God intends to use that weakness. So you flip Satan on his head and you flip the people that he's using on their head as well. Because, okay, I have some weaknesses, I have some deficiencies, but guess what? Everything that I have that you consider a weakness, God is going to use it. He's going to turn it around, and it's going to be for the betterment of somebody. And it may not be for me. It may be for the very person that's trying to throw dirt on your name. God may use your weakness to help them get strength. And that's fine. You just have to accept it, right? Accept what God is trying to use you for. There are times when God will take a strength and turn it into a weakness to use you more. So guess what? You can have something that you are very strong in, something that you excel in, something that you absolutely have a talent for, and God can take that strength and turn it into a weakness because he can use that even more. We know that God wrestled with Jacob all night, and Jacob would not let God go without God blessing him. And even in the midst of that, Jacob had strength. You have to have strength to wrestle with God all night. So Jacob had strength. And what did God do? He touched Jacob on his thigh and he knocked his hip out of place, right? So now Jacob's strongest asset, because we know that the thigh muscle is the strongest muscle in your entire body. And so when God took that muscle away, he took away Jacob's ability to walk, to run, and to wrestle the way he had been wrestling all night. So God can take our greatest strength and he can make it into a weakness, so he can use that weakness to prove a point to us, meaning that I'm God. I can take this strength, turn it into a weakness, and still use that weakness for good. And so how did that help Jacob? Well, Jacob was a person who liked to talk his way in and out of things. Jacob was a person who wanted to be a confidence man. Jacob was a person who wanted to be able to get away with things his whole life just by having a good vocabulary and being able to skip town or run away when things got too bad. Well, guess what God did? He touched him on the thigh and he knocked his hip out of place. So now the thing that Jacob was using to do what he had been doing for his whole life was no longer something he can do because he couldn't run anymore. His hip was knocked out of place. So he had a limp for the rest of his life. So that means that everything, his problems, the way he manipulated people, if he wanted to, he could still try to manipulate people, but because his hip was knocked out of place and now he had a permanent limp, he can no longer run away from people. He can no longer run away from the manipulation. He can no longer run away from the issues he had caused and tried to avoid. He had to stand there, and he had to take it, deal with it, and fix it. So God took what was his greatest strength, turned it into a weakness, but he took that weakness and he still used it for the benefit of Jacob because he made Jacob a better person, because now Jacob had to face his demons. He had to face his accusers. He had to think about his life in a different way, because the things that he got away with before, he was not going to be able to get away with again because he wasn't physically able to remove himself from those situations anymore because he had a limp. He had to be real. If you want God to bless you, you have to be willing to walk with the limp, because God uses weak, real people. So that's going to be our day 35, which we talked about God's power in your weakness. I really enjoyed this day. It spoke to me on a few different levels. I hope you did as well. Again, this is Mr. Ron Foster from the Pillar of Grace Church, Houston. You can catch us on Facebook Live. You can catch us on YouTube as well as Ministry on Demand. The website is pogch.org. If you wanted to give a love offering, you can do that as well on the website. If you want to become a member, there is a place on the website as well for you to become a member. And if you fill that information out, somebody from the church will get back with you in order to talk about your membership and your journey in Christ. And also we have, again, this is our last week of the 40 Days of Purpose. And so that, because it's our last week, yesterday we started a fast that will last from yesterday all the way until Friday evening at midnight. And so if you want to join in on that fast as well, you can get with us on Bible study, or get with us on our prayer line, which we have at 7:13 every day. This week we have prayer at 7:13 every single day. We usually only have it on Monday, but because this is our last week of the 40 days and because we're fasting, we will have prayer every single day this week, and we will have Bible study tomorrow at 7:13. So those are two opportunities for you to get on with us, to worship with us, to fellowship with us, and to get a prayer on your behalf if that is what you require, as well as to come to Bible study and share in our family atmosphere and learn about the Word of God. So again, I enjoyed you guys. I hope you enjoyed me as well. I thank you. I love you. Have a good evening.